Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, respected scholars, policymakers, and members of the audience, I stand before you today to speak about a subject that sits at the heart of our evolving global economy. The question of whether heavy tariffs imposed by the United States will affect the Indian economy. This is not a simple question with a simple answer. It is an inquiry that forces us to look deeply into the structure of modern international trade, the dynamics of economic interdependence, and the realities of national strategy in a world where the boundaries between domestic and global markets have nearly dissolved. To begin, let us understand what tariffs truly represent. A tariff is not just a tax on imports, it is a deliberate act of economic policy. It changes the relative prices of goods, alters the balance between domestic and foreign producers, and can reorient entire supply chains. Tariffs have been used throughout history as both protective armor and political weapon. They can shield a nation's industries, but they can also provoke retaliation, distort markets, and harm consumers. When the United States, one of the largest economies and trading powers in the world, imposes heavy tariffs, the consequences do not remain confined within its borders. They radiate outward, affecting trade partners, commodity prices, currencies, and even the strategic calculations of other nations. India, as one of the world's fastest growing economies and a significant player in global trade, cannot remain untouched by such actions. The United States is India's largest trading partner. The flow of goods and services between our two nations amounts to over $100 billion annually. India exports a wide variety of goods to the American market, from pharmaceuticals, textiles, gems, and engineering products to software services and digital solutions. In return, India imports sophisticated machinery, technology components, defense equipment, and energy products from the U.S. This interdependence is not merely commercial, it is strategic. It reflects a partnership that balances trade with technology, defense cooperation, and investment. Therefore, any shift in U.S. trade policy, especially one involving heavy tariffs, inevitably has consequences for India's economy. To understand how, we must first recognize that the global trading system has entered an era of realignment. The world that once celebrated free trade is now witnessing a resurgence of protectionism. Nations are increasingly prioritizing self-reliance and security over efficiency and openness. The United States, under multiple administrations, has expressed concerns about trade deficits, the loss of manufacturing jobs, and dependence on foreign supply chains. Heavy tariffs on imports have become a means to encourage domestic production and to punish what it perceives as unfair trading practices by other countries. Yet in doing so, these tariffs reshape the global market itself. When the U.S. imposes heavy tariffs on imports from major economies such as China, it does not only affect China. Companies around the world, which depend on Chinese inputs or operate across multiple countries, feel the impact. Production costs rise and global supply chains are forced to adapt. Some businesses shift their operations to alternative locations to bypass tariffs. This phenomenon, often called supply chain relocation, has both challenges and opportunities for India. On the one hand, as global firms search for new manufacturing bases, India can attract investment and become a preferred destination. On the other hand, if tariffs directly target Indian goods, our exporters could lose competitiveness in one of their most lucrative markets. Take the example of Indian textiles. The United States is one of the largest importers of garments and apparel. If heavy tariffs were to be imposed on Indian textiles, the immediate result would be higher prices for American consumers and reduced profit margins for Indian manufacturers. Competing nations such as Bangladesh and Vietnam, which enjoy certain trade privileges, could capture India's market share. In industries where margins are already thin, such a shock could lead to factory closures and job losses. Similarly, in sectors like engineering goods or chemicals, even a modest tariff can erode competitiveness. Indian exporters would find it difficult to absorb the additional costs without either raising prices or cutting production. The ripple effects could be felt in employment, investment, and overall economic sentiment. Yet, the story does not end there. Tariffs can also alter the balance of opportunity. When the U.S. imposed high tariffs on Chinese goods in recent years, many multinational corporations began looking for alternative manufacturing bases. Countries like Vietnam and Mexico benefited first, but India also began to emerge as an attractive destination. With its vast labor force, growing infrastructure, and government-backed initiatives such as Make in India and the production-linked incentive schemes, India stands at the cusp of becoming a global manufacturing hub. The redirection of supply chains could, in the long term, strengthen India's industrial base, provided we act swiftly and strategically to seize this moment. India's service sector, particularly information technology, deserves special mention. Tariffs typically target goods, not services, but the broader trade climate affects services too. The U.S. is the largest market for Indian IT exports, and policies related to digital trade, data localization, and visa regulations can function as indirect barriers. If the political climate in the U.S. turns more protectionist, it may impose tighter restrictions on outsourcing or on the movement of skilled labor. Such measures could affect India's IT revenues, employment, and investment in innovation. However, it is also true that American corporations depend heavily on Indian software expertise, and this mutual dependence provides room for negotiation and cooperation. Another major sector that connects India and the U.S. is pharmaceuticals. India is a leading supplier of generic medicines to the American market, offering affordable healthcare solutions to millions of U.S. citizens. Tariffs on Indian drugs would likely face strong domestic opposition in the U.S. because they would increase healthcare costs. Nonetheless, any change in tariff policy affecting raw materials or intermediates could increase production costs for Indian pharmaceutical firms. The government and industry would need to work closely to maintain competitiveness through innovation and efficiency. From a macroeconomic perspective, the imposition of U.S. tariffs could have several indirect consequences. Reduced export earnings could slow India's GDP growth, particularly if the tariffs cover a wide range of products. A fall in exports typically leads to a weaker rupee as foreign exchange inflows decline. This could make imports such as crude oil and machinery more expensive, adding inflationary pressure. However, a weaker rupee can also make Indian exports more competitive in other markets, helping to balance the overall effect. The Reserve Bank of India, with its strong track record of managing inflation and liquidity, would likely take steps to stabilize currency and credit markets. India's large domestic market provides a cushion that few other emerging economies possess. Unlike export-dependent economies, India's growth is driven substantially by domestic consumption and investment. Even if external trade faces temporary disruptions, internal demand for goods, services, housing, and infrastructure remains robust. This inherent resilience reduces India's vulnerability to global trade shocks. Furthermore, India's expanding middle class and rising rural incomes create an internal market that can absorb production shifts that might otherwise be lost to tariffs abroad. Beyond economics, tariffs have a strategic dimension. The relationship between India and the United States extends far beyond trade, encompassing defense cooperation, technology collaboration, climate initiatives, and shared democratic values. While trade disputes may arise, they are often resolved through dialogue rather than confrontation. In the past, when the U.S. withdrew trade benefits under the Generalized System of Preferences, both countries managed to maintain strong diplomatic ties. Similarly, even if tariffs were to be introduced today, it is likely that India and the U.S. would engage in negotiations to minimize disruptions. India could seek exemptions, revised schedules, or alternative trade arrangements to protect its key sectors. At the same time, India must continue diversifying its export destinations. Dependence on a single market always carries risks. Europe, Africa, Latin America, and the Asia-Pacific region all offer growing opportunities for Indian products and services. Bilateral and regional trade agreements with these regions could mitigate the impact of U.S. tariffs and open new frontiers of cooperation. The ongoing discussions for trade pacts with the European Union and the United Kingdom are steps in this direction. By spreading its trade footprint, India can reduce vulnerability and build a more balanced global presence. Looking at the broader picture, U.S. tariffs also create a push for greater self-reliance, not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of strength. India's policy of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India, aims to promote domestic production, technological innovation, and global competitiveness. Heavy tariffs by other nations can serve as a catalyst for accelerating these reforms. If India improves its infrastructure, logistics, and ease of doing business, it can turn global protectionism into an opportunity for domestic growth. In other words, what may appear as a short-term challenge can become a long-term advantage if approached with foresight and determination. It is also important to remember that trade relations operate within the framework of global institutions. The World Trade Organization provides mechanisms for dispute resolution and ensures that nations adhere to international trade norms. India, as a responsible member of the global community, can use diplomatic and legal avenues to safeguard its interests. At the same time, India must strengthen its competitive position by fostering innovation, investing in research and development, and nurturing industries that can stand on their own in global markets. The human dimension of trade should not be overlooked. Behind every export contract or tariff policy are workers, families, and small enterprises whose livelihoods depend on stable trade flows. A sudden imposition of tariffs can disrupt entire communities, especially in labor-intensive sectors like textiles, handicrafts, and small-scale manufacturing. Therefore, the government must ensure adequate support mechanisms, such as export credit facilities, retraining programs, and social safety nets, to help affected workers adapt to changing circumstances. Economic resilience is not only about statistics, it is about people. If we step back and look at history, we see that tariff wars rarely produce long-term winners. The protectionist wave that followed the Great Depression deepened global economic distress. In recent years, the US-China trade war led to short-term disruptions, but also accelerated the diversification of production networks. The lesson for India is clear. Instead of reacting defensively, it must act strategically. It should use the shifting trade order to strengthen its position as a reliable, rule-based, and innovation-driven economy. Tariffs may close one door, but they often open several others for those who are prepared to walk through them. Ultimately, the impact of U.S. heavy tariffs on the Indian economy will depend not merely on the tariffs themselves, but on how India responds. If we view them as a temporary setback and focus on resilience, reform, and diversification, the long-term damage can be minimized. If we use this moment to modernize our industries, enhance productivity, and expand our trade networks, we can transform the challenge into an opportunity for growth. In conclusion, while U.S. heavy tariffs may cause short-term disruptions in specific sectors, they are unlikely to derail India's economic progress. Our economy today is more robust, more diversified, and more adaptable than ever before. India's strengths, its entrepreneurial spirit, demographic vitality, and policy reforms give it the capacity to absorb shocks and emerge stronger. The road ahead will require patience, negotiation, and strategic foresight. But if India continues to move forward with confidence, investing in innovation and building partnerships around the world, it will not only withstand the effects of tariffs, but also rise to new heights of economic leadership. The global economy is in transition. The age of easy globalization has given way to an age of strategic interdependence. In this new world, power will not belong to those who build the highest barriers, but to those who build the most resilient bridges. India, with its balance of openness and self-reliance, its mix of tradition and technology, and its vision of inclusive growth, has every opportunity to lead. The challenge of U.S. tariffs, therefore, is not a threat. It is a test, and I have no doubt that India will pass this test with strength, wisdom, and resolve.